the 13th December. Smurfing it up already. 2021, December the 13th, 2021. And last couple of days, excuse me, like a lot of people, I'm sure, have been following terrible news of hurricanes that defy history. Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, Mississippi, Tennessee. Have been bludgeoned by over 30 tornadoes. Entire communities have been wiped from the map. Imagine entire communities flattened. This is out of Kentucky, I think, these pictures. From a drone. When you see the trees, and you see all the limbs are missing symmetrically from the ground up. And all the beak branches are snapped off. They're not snapped off, they're pulled off, they're twisted. They're not like they were broken. Because if you try to break a fresh branch, you can't break it. It has to be twisted off, right? So for the tornadoes, now a tornado, if you look up tornadoes, and these were supercelled tornadoes. You can thank Japan for these tornadoes. The longest in the world. The longest in the world, ever in world history. And duration. Now, normally, like a big tornado is generally considered a quarter mile wide. An unusual massive tornado would be considered a quarter mile wide, would last for 6 minutes. These lasted for around 13 hours. And bear with me 1 second. From around 360 kilometers. And so these I attribute to the radioactive fallout. Another name they gave radioactive fallout was global warming. Fukushima radioactive fallout maps. That's a map of xenon-133 decays in the cesium. This is a map of plutonium from Fukushima. These are modeled off of TEPCO's data. You can see radiation covering the planet. But what happens is, you look at this map, you see how the radiation leaves Japan and strikes Missouri, Arkansas, constantly, continuously. It's not like a plume of smoke from a backfire of a transport truck. It's constant, continuous, endless plume, wave after wave after wave, sustained. And so you're heating up the environment when you have these tornadoes. They're more invigorated. And so in order to tear all the limbs from the ground up and to turn the buildings into actual matchsticks, you're talking huge numbers. You're talking 250 plus mile per hour winds, because there's no building codes to protect you from these type of winds. They're not supposed to happen, right? We're now seeing these types of attributes show up in hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons and windstorms, random windstorms, where they all have this one attribute. They're sustained, they're monstrous sizes, and their wind speeds are unprecedented. In fact, 20 years ago, the only thing with those types of wind speeds were documentaries on Mars and planets in the solar system, but not Earth. And we know this because we don't have building codes for these types of winds. So Fukushima has created so much radiation covering the planet. They have changed the ecosystem. This was on top of all the nuclear testing, all the nuclear bomb fallouts, all the nuclear accidents, all the nuclear dumping that is constantly hemorrhaging. All the nuclear waste is stored above ground, all of it splitting the atom, creating invisible snowstorms from every direction on the planet, because nuclear is all around the planet, the facilities, and you have over 1,000 nuclear reactors that we know about, experimental reactors, submarines, etc., etc., etc. And that fuel has to go somewhere. It's all hemorrhaging radiation. And what I mean by that is, that's what fuel does, is hemorrhages radiation. It's hard to picture it, so I gave you an invisible snowstorm, because these atoms are pulsing energy at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per hour. That's what gamma and alpha and beta and neutrons are. That's their speed. So that's real energy. It does it every second. And we can't replicate it only through this process, but there's all the species, the 8 million species on the planet, don't have an autoimmune trigger to protect them from this. This is an alien. It meets all the definition of an alien, even biologically, even on the atomic scale, the subatomic particle scale. And so all species, anything that splits cells, is vulnerable on a whole different level. So as humans and animals, for instance, and birds, it gets in your body sequesters it in your muscles, your organs, and your bones, like it's part of the structure now, because it's electrically charged. It's pulsing energy every second at almost the speed of light inside your body, in every direction, not just in like a bullet. It's pulsing like an explosion. It's an actual explosion. And it wrecks your DNA and your chromosomes immediately. Your body responds in force. And so it makes white blood cells, and it sends white blood cells into the danger area to try to repair the damage, but you can't repair nuclear. So in increments over a decade or 2 or 3, it'll build an actual tumor around it, a sarcophagus around the radioactive particle that is sequestered in animals or insects or birds or humans or any species on the planet, plants. So your body attacks it with white blood cells. You get more radiation in your body. You're producing more white blood cells. In order to do that, you have a decrease. For every white blood cell you're making, you would lose a red blood cell. And eventually you get enough radiation in you, and you got so much white blood cells, you now have what's known as leukemia. You can get that from eating Japanese food, by the way, pretty quickly. And as they lifted the restrictions, in multiple countries, including the United Kingdom coming up. This is horrific pictures of trees that are stripped. Go try to strip a tree by hand. You can't actually do it, you know that? So imagine wind that is able to do something like that, and then turn everything into what's known as debris, basically. So all the little material you see is projectiles. Remember that also. Imagine putting your hand out the window of your car at 100 miles an hour. And then think about putting your hands out the window of your car at 250 miles an hour. So think about all the animals and birds and everything was in the way here, the devastation. And then, of course, the community, the people and their pets, and the trauma to those who might have survived. It's just my heart goes out to everybody. I can't imagine, so I've never been through that kind of event. That's cataclysmic. Surely must have felt like the end of the world. And this was an extraordinary wide tornado in particular. This whole event produced at nighttime 30 tornadoes in areas that normally don't get tornadoes on top of that. So would you rebuild your home back in this place here? If you survived this? It's just something, isn't it? I'm absolutely gutted by everything I've seen. It's so hard to look at. These pictures really tell the story of a supercelled tornado that's not created by nature but by man, and is created by radioactive fallout, in particular from the constant plumes coming out of Japan, has heated up our planet. I'm sorry, there's no planets with a plural. These are my biggest fears. This is something that we postulated back in the day, and we started seeing manifest shortly after, were supercelled storms, supercelled hurricanes, and supercelled typhoons, supercell cyclones, and horrifically supercell tornadoes. My goodness. Now, the supercell cyclones are the same as a tornado, the same speeds. They call them cyclones. But we've seen one down in China that stripped 500 million trees in just one little spot. It went a lot further in other countries on top of that. But holy. When you look at these trees here, I can't imagine, because I've never been through, I've been through a lot of serious storms on the ocean, but nothing that got a handle on this. And I'm just heartbroken for all these families. And, you know, like I'm left with no choice but to think, well, what if that was my home right here? And my loved ones were in it, and I was at work, and I came home and seen this, or if I just struggled from out under the debris and was walking around in shock. That's going to last forever. that kind of shock, right? And it happens in the dark on the drop of a hat. You have no warning unless you might catch a warning on TV a few minutes before it happens. And of course, at that point, you don't have the time to collect your thoughts, and so you get caught off guard. And let's see, we haven't got. So this footage just, I thought, really told the story. Oh, sorry about that. The longest tornado track in U.S. history. Just absurd, isn't it? Tornadoes are not supposed to do that. Did somebody forget to tell the tornado not to do that? And how long is it going to take them to go through all of this rubble to find out if there's anybody alive there? Because even the so-called first responders, as you can see in these pictures, are barely to be found. This was a drone sent in immediately after daylight by the looks of it. Over 100 tornado warnings were issued. So this was a supercell. Now, there was footage out there from people's cell phones. And, of course, you know how a cell phone camera works when it's completely dark and you get a little bit of lightning. It's still going to be a very grainy picture. But there was some glimpses of the tornado. And it was massive, but you couldn't really tell, right? Just like getting hit with a freight train, only worse. Unbelievable. Just heartbreaking amount of damage. That was Amazon warehouse collapsed. Those trees you see pulled out of the ground, they're not young trees. They're very 60, 70-year-old trees. Yeah, you just see the heartbreaking stories. Okay, so let's jump into nuclear. .88 curies per gram of strontium, and a curie and each curie is about, well, because like strontium and cesium have different curies per gram. Generally, the consensus is 78 times 78 billion atoms. And an atom can give you an illness, a disease, and cancer down the road. So when you're talking about 12 million pounds per fuel pool, set of fuel pools in Japan, you're talking about an absurd amount of atoms, an invisible snowstorm. And we gave you, that's why these models look like that, because there's so many atoms, it's an invisible snowstorm. And that's why you see models like this also of radioactive fallout. That changes the climate, see? Well, the whole country is full of radiation. Look at it. Hi, Miles. David Holly. Hello, everybody. Meadow World. Colette. Mike Mansfield. Meadow World. William Joseph. Hello, everybody. Tritium. Naturally occurring tritium, extremely rare on Earth, and the atmosphere is only trace amounts pre-nuclear, formed by the interaction of gases with cosmic rays. Naturally occurring tritium is extremely rare on Earth. And the tritium from nuclear is not tritium, it's tritium-3H. It's completely different than natural tritium. And so what they done was they conflated it and left people who didn't know any better very confused about whether it was harmful or not. Hydrogen-3. It's still different than the man-made dog in this whole decay chain. And still can be produced by radiating lithium metal or lithium-bearing ceramic pebbles in a nuclear reactor. And tritiated, is what they also describe as water when it's contaminated. Even if it's contaminated with uranium and plutonium and americium and neptunium and curium, they still try to just call it tritium, tritiated water, in order to deceive you. All nuclear power plants are hemorrhaging tritium into your communities and your rivers and your oceans, wherever they may be located. Naturally occurring tritium is extremely rare. Naturally occurring and extremely rare. The atmosphere is only traces, so everywhere you look, that's what you're going to find. But tritium-3H is a neutron-rich tritium. This is important for later on in the show. Has an unstable beta decay, which is a bone seeker. Operations involving the movement of tritium were rigorously controlled by approved procedures. The original charters for nuclear was it would not emit any radiation into the environment whatsoever, and they agreed upon that. And they never stopped stabbing 8 million species and humanity in the back since. Extensive training and qualification of the staff was an important element in the program when it came to tritium protection. There's a big protocol in the institutions where you have tritium to protect students and the building and the laboratory from the radiation. It's also a byproduct production of electricity by nuclear power plants, and the name of this isotope is formed from the Greek word meaning third. Why do we use this Greek ideology? Beta particles from tritium can penetrate only about 6.0 millimeters of air, and in the body, which it absorbs because it's like water, so it absorbs into the body easily. It attacks your DNA and your chromosome and your organs because it assimilates into it, right? And so it's pulsing energy every second for 120 years, but it could decay into something else that could last 1 million years. It has 10 decays, and which is 0.23 of an inch. But if it's in your body, it doesn't matter what its decay change is, your body attacks it with white blood cells for the rest of your life. And so if you get millions and millions of it in your body, and you did if you were in North America after Fukushima, then it causes it causes immune difficulties, stress right away, which leaves you more susceptible to pathogens and viruses that were normally benign and innocuous and harmless. Tritium can penetrate only about 6 millimeters a year. Well, that doesn't matter. It's a radioactive isotope that the body will attack with white blood cells forever. Because you're not going to live through 10 half-lives of the... Now, you can't have tritium without uranium and plutonium and americium and 1,000 other fission products that they managed to sweep under the proverbial rug. Most important source due to the releases of tritiated water of tritium in nuclear power plants stem from the boric acid, commonly used as a chemical shim to compensate an excess of initial reactivity. Main reactions which the tritium is generated from boron. Fission probably produces more tritium than all other sources. And we've covered that over the years about these fission reactors can't contain the tritium, radioactive water. And they're not going to store it. They'll boil it off. If they can't release it directly into your lakes or rivers or oceans, they'll just boil it off. And they all got pipes. There's 440 plants. They all got pipes into the oceans and rivers where they released the radiation because this cult, nobody's allowed to have any input on it. Tritium occurs in nuclear power plants in the form of tritiated water. Drinking large amounts of alcohol reduce the biological half-life of water in the body. So you can actually get rid of tritium by getting drunk. Because tritium is assimilated into the water in your body. But it's true, right? It's stupid, but it's true. But if you're saturated, the whole environment is, you're just going to bioaccumulate it. So you can't bioaccumulate any more potassium than your body's already governed at, right? Your body governs the amount of radiation. Natural, it's not really radiation or emitters, but it's been classified that by the scumbag in the nuclear industry, which reminds me, we have a poll for everybody. Should nuclear power be renamed a nuclear death cult? Got 90% says yes. A couple of people made a mistake and said no. Why would you be on my site if you were pro-nuclear? How'd you last this long? So, like, growing food by any kind of waste, whether it was oil or chemicals or whatever, is not acceptable, right? So why would growing food and harvesting it for markets, right along bags, 1-ton bags of nuclear waste, how is that considered acceptable? And over there is Japan, as you can see with that particular. That's 14 prefectures. Now, United Kingdom is only has a ban on 8 prefectures, but 55 countries had a ban on 14 prefectures, which was half of Japan. And they were right to. And they lifted those this year, 2021, and they shouldn't. Because there's about 1,000 kinds of radioactive material, and they're only checking for cesium. And obviously they're not checking for cesium because they're harvesting food right alongside of nuclear waste. Like pre-Fukushima, you could not make up that picture on your own. People are like, well, what's he doing? Is that a dump there or something? You're like, no, that's bags of nuclear. You're like, they can't do stuff like that. No one would ever do stuff like that. It's stupid. No, it's normal. They tell you got to worry about cesium, but there's 1,000 kinds of radioactive material. Here was another radioactive fallout. Unprecedented spike. Think about the first word, unprecedented. Unprecedented. So in California, this is a Neptunium-239. There's another model of sulfur peroxide hydrogen buckyballs known as the sulfur, radioactive sulfur. And this study, that's what they're alluding to, was the sulfur peroxide hydrogen buckyballs at 1,500 atoms per meter, or cubic meter of air. There's another study showing that males in the same place from a different institution were aggregating 360 atoms of sulfur each day sequestered into their testicles. And so you can imagine this being true with insects and birds and animals. It sterilizes those immediately compared to humans, but they're not, because this stuff doesn't just disappear. It sequesters in the bodies. In their new film, environmentalist David Suzuki, well, he's part of that death cult that we were just talking about. Nuclear power shouldn't nuclear power be renamed nuclear death cult? We got 86% says yes, and 14% says no. That's obviously the pro-nuclear community saying, no, you can't do that because my children will find out I'm a monster. In their new film, environmentalist David Suzuki, by the way, remember David Suzuki after Fukushima in 2013 at a lecture in Alberta, Canada. He was caught on cell phone being asked a question. And his response was, Fukushima is the most terrifying situation I can imagine. And I seen a paper that said it was bye-bye Japan. And to evacuate North America's west coast if Unit 4 goes after a quake and the nuclear power plant's fuel rods are exposed. So bye-bye Japan was because of radioactive fallout, and should evacuate the west coast over there on the Pacific, Canada and United States and Mexico, etc., because of the radioactive fallout. Here's another model of just one particular isotope. Now, he's not saying, you'll never see David Suzuki say, I've seen a paper which says bye-bye Japan and to evacuate North America's west coast if the coal plant breaks down. And you're not going to see a statement from anybody on the planet saying, I've seen a paper which says it's bye-bye Japan and to evacuate the North American west coast if the oil plant breaks down or the gas plant breaks down. But the only time you're going to hear it is if the nuclear power plant goes after a quake. So if your nuclear power plant breaks down, bye-bye to whatever country got it, and you should evacuate the coastline of whatever ocean the prevailing winds are going to blow it to. So gas, oil, and coal emissions don't do this. Nuclear is the only emissions which cover the planet in invisible plumes. And that these invisible plumes, by the way, pulse energy at the speed of light every second, heating the planet up. But let's listen to David Suzuki say it himself. The building to the right in the middle is the building he's talking about. The two red depictions to the far right at the top of the reactor buildings are the fuel pools he's talking about. He said if they goes, it's bye-bye Japan.
3 out of the 4 plants were destroyed in the earthquake and in the tsunami. The 4th one has been so badly damaged that the fear is if there's another earthquake of a 7 or above, that building will go, and then all hell breaks loose. I have seen a paper which says that if, in fact, the 4th plant goes under an earthquake and those rods are exposed, it's bye-bye Japan. And everybody on the west coast of North America should evacuate. Now, if that isn't terrifying, I don't know what. Fukushima is the most terrifying situation I can imagine.
And it's gone. U.S. study, radioactive xenon-133 in Washington was 450,000 times above detection levels after Fukushima, and it persisted for weeks. This is the actual model of what we're talking about. And it not only persisted for weeks, this model, this is the prediction between March the 12th of the first detonation to 4 days later. So you can imagine after 2 weeks, all of the southern hemisphere is gone also. So when Suzuki mentions Fukushima, that kind of pisses me off. So they're reframing the narrative about Fukushima. We have to reframe the crisis, David Suzuki says. We're at an opportune moment. We're in trouble. We're in deep trouble. And the heat dome is actually Fukushima. And atmospheric rivers, which is Fukushima dominating, have made British Columbia the poster child for what's coming. And I've done research expeditions throughout that whole coastline year after year. It's an extinction event. The species are gone. And if you go to my site, The Nuclear Proctologist, you scroll down a little bit, you'll see the before and after pictures of the coastline of British Columbia. And it's really something. We're trying to coordinate every environmental group. We're trying to coordinate every environmental group. We're trying to boss around every environmental group. We're trying to get every environmental group to do our bidding. We're trying to use every environmental group as a weapon against you and your planet, is what he's saying. We have to reduce our energy use in the next year by 25%. In the next year, the next 12 months. Almost the entire ground level of the northern hemisphere was covered in radioactive fission products after Fukushima, is what he don't want you to think about and put into that equation. He doesn't want you to understand that. What a despicable sack of shit he turned out to be. This was France's model of the radioactive fallout from Japan. This is the Pacific Ocean. That's Hawaii right there, well it was. This is the Atlantic Ocean. This is Europe. This is planet Earth. Like, how much evidence do you actually need? I'll get it for you. Tell me what you need. I'll go get it for you. I will do that for you. So he doesn't acknowledge the death of the oceans from the radiation, doesn't acknowledge the radioactive plumes, despite the fact that he acknowledges that Fukushima is the most terrifying situation you can imagine. Bye-bye Japan, and evacuate the west coast of North America. And you're not going to solve that problem by reducing your energy by 25% over the next year. You got to reduce the radiation by 25% over the next year that is hemorrhaging constantly from nuclear meltdowns. And I don't understand why the world doesn't fight back. Not very hard to fight back, you know. Tell the truth, be honest. So it's not just the Pacific, it's the Atlantic. It's not just Japan, it's the planet. We're all going down on the same ship. Suzuki says, I know that can happen because after Fukushima, the Japanese public, without legislation, reduced their energy use by 25% and maintained the reduction all these years since. But that's not going to solve Fukushima. Nothing wrong with it, but it's not going to solve Fukushima. Right? So he's not... you have to keep climate change at the forefront about everything you do. If that's the case, then climate change, like those tornadoes we talked about earlier, and like the radioactive fallout from all the different models, and we got the documentation of it landing on top of that. Deteriorating plant threatens mass extinction around the world. Now, you won't hear that statement about a coal plant or an oil plant or a gas plant or about carbon. Now, they're using carbon, right, to replace what Fukushima is doing. But carbon doesn't pulse energy every second. Radiation does. Carbon can't heat up the planet on its own. If I take all the carbon they're talking about and put it in a pile, it's going to do nothing. If I take all of this radiation, put it in a pile, you can't get within miles of it, and it's still releasing, splitting the atom, producing deadly toxic materials that are going around the planet. So a deteriorating plant threatens mass extinction around the world. Suzuki talking about bye-bye Japan should evacuate the coastlines in North America if it goes, because it produces radioactive fallout like that, which is exactly what happened. So it's not just hemorrhaging in the ocean, it's pouring into the skies. And so they're pretending, the people to the right are like Suzuki, they're pretending they're in the building to the left. If you go in the building to the left, you die. The structure you see is right there is not physically touching the building, because the building actually looks like that to the left. They built the structure so it cantilevers over the building, and then they pretend that they're in the building to the right. All the media worldwide done that. So we got a huge problem. We got all the media worldwide pretending look at the media to the right. They're pretending they're in a fuel pool at the top of the building to the left that doesn't even exist. Germany tells France nuclear is not green. Germany will oppose France's efforts to label nuclear electricity as green energy. Germany's new foreign minister said in Paris on Thursday. Yeah, big bullies. France is disgusting. The politicians in France are utterly disgusting. Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom says Russia's invasion could spark a nuclear disaster like Chernobyl. And it could. And Russia doesn't care. Why would Russia care? They won't even give the children in orphanages in Ukraine and Belarus a color television set, let alone a television set. Germany will oppose the French efforts to label nuclear electricity as green energy. Thank goodness. Ukraine ambassador to the UK says Russia invasion, there we go, sorry. Proposal will expand aid to more victims of nuclear weapons tests. So one of these people there could be Kevin Blanchard's father. And that's what they were tricked into doing. Oh, no, you'll be okay. But these were meant to get poisoned and be studied like lab rats for the rest of their lives, yeah? A 30-year-old federal fund compensates people sickened by radiation from nuclear weapons testing in the West. So it's not just the soldiers, it's people in the West. Are set to expire next year, and a new proposal would extend and expand it. The proposed changes to the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act would allow far more downwinders to seek aid, including people in Montana, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico, Guam, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, all poisoned by constant radioactive fallout. So when you see models of Fukushima radioactive fallout, then compensation needs to be expanded to all humans and all 8 million species for the revolting legacy of nuclear. Montana, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico, Guam, and Utah would expand eligibility in the Utah, Arizona, and Nevada. Lawmakers largely agree that the government's officials should have been more transparent about what they knew when the testing began, because they knew they were going to get irradiated. And that's the problem with nuclear scientists, is they're actually monsters. Material fallout could cause illnesses and cancers and deaths, heart problems and liver and lung and respiratory and pituitary and thyroid and adrenaline, literally blanketing parts of the United States, including Utah, on top of that with poisonous air. So that Russia wouldn't do it to you. And all these nuclear weapons they can't even use without killing the planet. There's no way to win for anybody. Unless you're the weapons producers. You win because you can't use it and you get all the money. And you destroy all those precious resources. Those precious metals now are radioactive, forever useless. Russia to help Serbia build a center for nuclear science and technology. Of course, like the Russian nuclear renaissance ended after Chernobyl, they decided to go and destroy other countries they didn't irradiate with Chernobyl. National experts assembled for $500 million parks nuke dump cleanup. If you go look at China and scumbag Israel and India and Pakistan and Canada and everywhere else, the amount of money, they estimate Hanford, for instance, who spent over $1 trillion on trying to clean it up already, is going to need another $700 billion at least. And 90% of the money actually goes to administration. On top of that is what has been recorded worldwide. They don't want to clean it up. They want it hemorrhaging into the environment, splitting the atom forever, exterminating all the species. And you need to wake up and go back and get busy and get to war like me. Proposal to withdraw from nuclear waste talks defeated by Alderdale Council, which is United Kingdom, over by Sellafield. Why would you, because you get money to have a conversation, you get millions of dollars just to have the conversation. And then somebody else gets elected and they get millions of dollars to keep the conversation going. The idea is never have a nuclear repository, so let's build it in a community where nobody wants it and they'll fight about it for decades. All right, so if you look at Yucca Mountain, they had $20 billion in litigation alone. $20 billion. So they could have built a repository rather than... It was kickbacks to keep the circus, the pony show, moving forward. New Australian nuclear waste facility is built in a farming community for medical waste, by the way. They need a deep geological repository for medical waste, like sewage and stuff like this. So to give you the radiation, you have to stay in a special room, what's known as $1 million room. It's completely lined with lead shielding to the walls to protect the nurses and the people in the hallways. And then your urine and your excrements go into a separate sewage system that has a special truck that retrieves it and brings it to a nuclear holding site where it's contaminated. And that's the kind of stuff they want to put down in a deep geological repository in Australia, is the medical stuff. And even the ashes of the people who get murdered by the radiation, when they die, the ashes radiate the crematoriums. So nuclear testing changed the outer atmosphere. So underground nuclear explosions, you ever seen pictures of them? You'll see the ground heave up. You see emissions start to come up. But it's hard to appreciate is you split the ground. And so over the next little while, the radiation has to start emitting from that. Because underground, you create a big cavern. That's a radioactive hellhole. And the temperatures in these places are 400 and 500 degrees for decades, by the way. And that emission slowly of radioactivity is always emitting from these holes in the ground that they created. Effects in the outer ionosphere, like somewhere from, say, 200 miles to 1,000 miles into space, from underground explosions. The power acoustic influence on the well, basically, it creates a noise, is how they recognize it. But it's actually emissions. So a reactor, in order to make it more efficient, they increase the pressure, which lowers the boiling point of water, right? And so a typical reactor is 75 atmospheric pressures, which is 1,000 to 1,100 pounds per square inch. So when they go off, when they get embrittled and their pressure is 1,000 psi, it's a lot worse than a car tire blowing up. And you've seen car tires blow up? Look it up. So that boils in the core at about 285 degrees Celsius, 550 degrees Fahrenheit. In comparison, in a high pressure, you're looking at around 2,300 psi, 158 atmospheres. 158 atmospheres, 2,300 psi. So when that detonates, that's a projectile. So that's why the reactors were only meant to last 30 years, because of the Wigner effect, the neutron effect on the metal made it very brittle and made it susceptible, right, to cracks. If you get a crack at 2,300 psi, you know what follows. An overview of reports and current research concerning childhood leukemia and cancer around nuclear installations in the United Kingdom. Hang on here. United Kingdom. All nuclear power plants got one thing in common. And it ain't cool. Hang on, I'll get there. Maybe. So what I've done was I created it. Oh man. Oh. I created a separate spot so I can find stuff. Now I can't find that separate spot. So all nuclear power plants have one thing in common. They're surrounded by farms. And this is United Kingdom. Surrounded by farms. This is new United Kingdom reactor they're going to bring online. It's surrounded by farms. And we have endless studies showing that's a stupid idea. So why are they building all these nuclear power plants in farmland? Well, that turns out to be super evil. So they can poison you. All nuclear power plants are hemorrhaging radiation into the environment. So you expect a lot of illnesses. Like bad teeth is emblematic of radiation sickness. An overview of reports and current research, or generations of it, concerning childhood leukemias and cancers around nuclear installations. And the University of Oxford. And they say the cluster in C scale, which is right closest to the Sellafield nuclear reprocessing plant surrounded by farms, may be the result of germ cell mutations in the fathers of the affected children. In the village closest to a nuclear reprocessing plant. They're trying to blame it on some random germ. In the fathers of the victims, can changes in population mixing and social economic just reminded me of a study where they blamed it, I don't have it there today unfortunately, where they blamed it on a flu, all the child cancers, the clusters of child leukemias. Here they're trying to blame it on population mixing. The United Kingdom is just savages. And this is from the Institution of Health and Society in the United Kingdom. Like, when you see a government institution that says health and science, it's been taken over by the industries and it's now a weapon against you and your communities and your loved ones. If that doesn't terrify you, what the hell does? That's what I mean by the study we got tonight. We got a poll rather tonight. Should the nuclear power be renamed a nuclear death cult? And desperation in the nuclear industry is like, no, you can't tell them what we like. Can changes in population mixing be behind the cancer clusters around a nuclear meltdown? By the way, Sellafield is actually a nuclear meltdown. And it's an ongoing nuclear meltdown from a mixed oxide facility in the 50s. There's 8 million liters a day hemorrhaging into the ocean and is surrounded by farms. That's Sellafield. And that is madness. So one of the big stories today, which is why I'm censored so much tonight, is Britain's lifting post-Fukushima restrictions on Japan food imports. Now, of course, Britain is growing food right by nuclear meltdowns, but they got to keep the population complacent. And so they say, oh no, we got a ban on food. They actually had a ban on some products from 8 prefectures because they like that particular food. They don't want to end up eating it, basically. Now they're going to, in the spring, they're allegedly going to have a public comment, which means to go F yourselves. Britain lifting post-Fukushima restrictions. That way they can find out who the anti-nuclears are. Britain lifting post-Fukushima restriction on Japan food imports. They show you fish, but the biggest import is rice. Rice is incorporated into cookies and foods and sweets for children and pet food and everything else. Potentially clearing the hurdles for such imports as early as next spring, the Cookie Farm Minister said. Potentially clearing the hurdles, as if there was hurdles. Britain has concluded that removing the import restrictions would not affect consumers in the country. They said, well, we're poisoning them already with food, so why would it bother them now? Bear with me. Because Japan is lunatic. It's a lunatic. It's incredible lunatic. Well, the nuclear industry, right? You can't blame Japan. You gotta, like, harvesting food for sale right by nuclear one-ton bags, thousands of one-ton bags, in an evacuation zone on top of that where nobody lives and growing food there. They never stopped growing food there. They never stopped for a second growing food there. As part of the domestic procedure, Britain will solicit public comments on the policies. So if everybody sends one of these types of pictures with their comment, I don't want to eat food from a nuclear wasteland. Which is the appropriate thing to say, right? And these bags are picked up to trick people into going back there. And they even left the bags there and complained because you wouldn't go back in there. Well, we picked up all the radiation. Well, it doesn't work that way. You can't pick up all the radiation. 10 years after Fukushima nuclear disaster, the United States lifted the food import bans. September 22nd of this year, America come out. Total 100 items from 14 prefectures, including rice and mushrooms, from Fukushima prefectures can now be exported to the United States. Now, Britain has 8. The United States had 14 prefectures. When you subtract the states that Britain didn't have on the ban list and should have, one of them is Fukushima. Wasn't on the ban list, but other prefectures were. So Britain's been importing from Fukushima, but not other prefectures. Oh, and Chiba, which is right alongside of Tokyo. You don't want to eat anything from Tokyo. Tokyo is huge numbers. I don't want to eat anything from Japan, anywhere in Japan. There we go, that one there. Why would you take the chance, right? So food was banned in America by 14 prefectures. United Kingdom didn't even have a ban from Fukushima or Chiba. Which was, they just regurgitated the Kyoto story, by the way. Britain, on top of that, media has not reported on this, just the Japanese media. So Britain hasn't had the conversation. That's why I'm censored so much tonight. Britain lifting well, I'm censored all the time. Anyway, Britain's lifting post-Fukushima restrictions on Japanese food imports. When Sellafield melted down in the United Kingdom, did they go to nuclear power plants and look for volunteers? Or did they go to the nuclear universities and look for the experts? Did they go to the nuclear companies and ask them to give them a hand? Or did they go to the theaters and jack the people from the back rows of the theaters?
The police.
Let me start that again. And in the 50s, when this happened, the poor people sat in the back rows, right?
The police from the factory had turned up looking for volunteers, and they brought a bus, and they decided the best way to get the volunteers was to go to the cinema and volunteer the back 2 rows at the show to go into the factory to, as it turned out, to help push the fuel rods out of the reactor.
Now, he's not saying the police went there and asked for volunteers. Hey, do you want to volunteer to go into a nuclear meltdown and push the fuel rods out of the melting reactor? Get a lethal dose? Because it used to be called Windscale back then. They changed the name after they done that to Sellafield. Now, Sellafield also has a reprocessing facility there for fuel, where they reclaim the uranium, reclaim the hot particles, the plutonium, So I usually start this story off years ago with a joke was, how come nuclear scientists don't sit in the back rows of theaters? And this was the punchline. Because he used to kidnap people from the back rows. He says volunteered, so the documentary went with that one, right? That's kidnapping. Come on, you're going with me. That's kidnapping. So they should sue the police who done that anyway. At least do that much. Britain lifting the post-Fukushima restrictions on Japan food imports, not reported by Britain. Japan is out there gloating, right? The nuclear industry is out there gloating about it, but not in the official media. Same as when America lifted all the restrictions. Nobody in America reported on it. Like it didn't even happen. Potentially clearing the hurdles for such imports as early as next spring. Japan reported on it. So there is no media, obviously. That should horrify you, terrify you. Potentially clearing the hurdles for such importance as imports as early as next spring. You know, from a nuclear meltdown, nuclear wasteland. In its assessment of the possible health risk, From Japan food imports, Britain has concluded that removing the import restrictions would not affect consumers in the country. And as part of the domestic procedure, Britain will solicit public comments on the policy change by February before making a formal decision. So, one thing I'll guarantee you is that the United Kingdom media doesn't inform the population so they can comment. Because that's what United Kingdom or the EU just done, and Iceland and Norway just done the same thing, and the United States done the same thing, but their medias didn't report on it. Only Japan media did. Said the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries, and Genocide. A total of 23 farm products. Mushrooms, bamboo shoots, bonitos from Fukushima, 8 other prefectures are currently subject to the import restrictions, requiring proof of having passed the check of radioactive materials when they're shipped into Britain. And of course, we know they've been shipping it out of Fukushima prefectures and surrounding prefectures to other prefectures and then relabeling it as if it come out of Fukushima. That picture is from a major media in Japan complaining because people didn't want to buy the radioactive food, saying the farmers had went through a lot of trouble to check their radiation with the Geiger counters provided by the government. Now, originally the government gave the farmers Geiger counters. They said check the food for 500 becquerels a kilogram. If it's over that, you mix it with food with no radiation and bring the numbers down. Like, that's not the farmer's job. First off, you can only measure some gamma with those types of Geiger counters. You can't measure alpha and beta and neutrons, like plutonium and uranium. And it's absurd. The whole story is absurd. And it seems impossible, right? Nah, they're not. There's no murderous genocide machine on the go, Dana. Well, actually, there is. The 8 prefectures of Miyagi, Yamagata, Ibaraki, Guma, Niigata, Yamanishi, and Nagano, and I'm going to butcher that name too, I suppose. So, not Chiba, not Fukushima, wasn't even on the list of banned prefectures. And so the gray ones, grayish dark colors, that's the prefectures. So Fukushima and Chiba are not on the list. Iwate 100% should be on the list, for goodness sakes. And so that's a cruel map that I put together for you. If the restrictions are lifted, the certificates of origin now required from these farms' products harvested or processed in Japanese prefectures other than the 9 will also become unnecessary for exporting to Britain. And the money they're talking about is not very much money to poison millions of people. So it's a genocide. So that's why we got a poll tonight. And the poll is, should the nuclear nuclear power be renamed the nuclear death cult, which I've already done. And you got 83% says yes, nuclear should be renamed a death cult. And amazingly, 16% says no, nuclear genocide machine. So, the death cult is present here tonight. Japanese farm exports to Britain recovered to 5.6 billion yen in 2020. Recovered. Japanese farm exports to Britain recovered. The United States lifted its import restrictions, yet the media didn't even report on it in the Western Hemisphere. In September, while the European Union done it in October. Let's go back to 2020 to really appreciate how batshit lunatic, kooky this planet is. This is an exclusion zone. So it's an exclusion zone because of radiation. So that should be perfect place to grow new vegetables, right? Reusing decontaminated soil following the nuclear accident. Reusing soil decontaminated following the nuclear accident. So they took the radioactive soil and said they decontaminated it. It's like saying you decontaminated water that's radioactive. You can't. The ministry received only nearly 3,000 public comments, most of which are opposed to the proposal. Opposed to reusing the soil, saying it will spread the contamination. We will provide detailed explanations to seek understandings for our willingness to take a step forward, even if it's just a small one. We will be conducted in Nagadoro district in Lydia, Fukushima prefecture. It's designated as a difficult to return zone because the radiation remains high since the triple nuclear power plant reactors melted down. The ministry is seeking to reuse decontaminated soil for public construction work, farmland development, if the radiation levels of the soil is below a certain standard, or to make solid fuel for biomass power generation were grown on land using the decontaminated soil. So what that does is you suck up the radiation into the plants, you burn the plants and liberate the radiation isotopes back into the environment because incineration can't destroy the radiation. The ministry initially planned to revise the related ordinance in April to enable the soil to be reused, saying it obtained results that showed the soil was safe enough to be used for growing crops in the nuclear wasteland on top of that. So 5,000 becquerels or lower per kilogram. So if you decontaminate the soil, 55 becquerels, by the way, per square meter on a nuclear power plant site is an evacuation zone. 5,000 becquerels per kilogram. If you multiply that by 68, you get the square meter. It's 340,000 becquerels per square meter. Is not and we're only talking about gamma there, because that's all they recognize. They don't recognize any other isotope in human history, just cesium-137. The total amount of soil stored at such facilities is expected to reach about 14 million cubic meters. But we actually have evidence now suggesting it's significantly higher than that.
There's about 60 million tons of contaminated soil that's being... There's about 60 million tons of contaminated soil that's being stored, planned to be stored, outside the Fukushima Daiichi perimeter fence. So
60 million one-ton bags of radiation. They want to take that now and grow food in it in a nuclear wasteland and ship it to you and your loved ones. Childhood cancer and nuclear installation now coming to your local supermarkets. I think the first thing is to say that there is a well-established excess around Sellafield of childhood leukemia, although excesses around other nuclear sites of a lower magnitude. Yeah, but Sellafield had a nuclear meltdown that's still ongoing and is hemorrhaging 8 million liters a day into the ocean. And it's a reprocessing site, like La Hague or Donneray or Sellafield itself, or Windscale, as it used to be called. The excess near Sellafield is strongly associated with fathers having high exposures to external whole-body penetrating radiation while working at the installation before the child's conception. The people around Seascale and Crumbia and places like this around Sellafield, United Kingdom, are a lot of migrants. You bring in a lot of migrants to do the radiation work because they're migratory, so to speak. They're transient, you know. They're trying to survive in a different country. And so they don't go into the official statistics. And what they're trying to do there is they're trying to frame the narrative that the only cancers will be the fathers were all working at the nuclear site itself, right? That's simply not true. Another possibility is genetic damage. Most geneticists, not all, but most apparently, and radiobiologists, will consider that the levels of occupational exposures, even at Sellafield, are too low for this to be plausible pathway on current knowledge. Now, first off, it's a nuclear meltdown, you disgusting parasite. It's surrounded by farms. On top of that, the disgusting parasite nuclear industry. Its missions have been coming out of there for 70 years. Not just the reprocessing from there has contaminated the Arctic Sea, for goodness sakes. This is based to some extent on lack of any similar effect among children born to Japanese survivors of the atomic bomb. And what they done with that is they built the city right back on the bomb crater, a nuclear bomb crater. And that there is a very high rate of abnormality and heart problems, liver problems for the whole population. And you would blame that on cigarettes and alcohol and tobacco, right? But they only studied the Japanese population for external doses. They didn't study them for internal doses. For the last 76 years, they've been studying the population there. Every facet of it is so important. However, the scenario is somewhat different, contrasting a high short-term exposure with a lower long-term exposure, a high short-term exposure for the nuclear detonation, which leaves a lot of radiation, permanent radiation. In fact, you still find it there today, such as plutonium, which we have not yet been able to analyze for. So they're saying they excluded plutonium because they can't, which means they can't look for americium or neptunium or curium, which is the biggest byproduct. Other causes have suggested for the excess childhood leukemias levels, in particular around nuclear establishments, is population movement. So, like, this is absurd to suggest that population movement is to blame for the cancer clusters next to an ongoing nuclear meltdown. It's not disingenuous and dishonest and deceptive and deceitful. It's despicable. Implicating viruses that have long been considered to be associated with childhood leukemias. Now, that's a new one on me. I've never heard of viruses being associated with childhood leukemias. Only from the United Kingdom, lunatic, coward, infiltrated institutions. High rates in isolated communities. Oh yeah, so isolating a community means there's higher rates of cancers. I grew up in a community which today only has 65 people, still has no automobiles. And so, like, if somebody was coming home from the shop and they weren't healthy, the children automatically took the food and ran home to their house and dropped it off and came back and helped them to their homes. And they wouldn't take a nickel for it. You were required to do that minimum. If you see them lugging water from the well, because I grew up, we had no running water, and you have to lug your water from the well every morning, a couple of buckets of water. And I remember I used to struggle with 5 gallon, well, we used 6 gallon buckets, and you put around 5 gallons in each bucket. And this scrawny little 12, 13-year-old lugging almost 100 pounds. And one of my neighbors on the way home had a couple of geese, pet geese. And the geese would attack me every morning. And so if you fought back, the geese would just, they would mirage you. They'd fly up, pound on you. I had it hundreds of times happen to me where I got beat up by geese. Still traumatized every time I see a geese feather. Nuclear power plant employees donate more than $4.3 million to the local community. Workers at the fleet's 12 nuclear power plants and fellow corporate employees pledged $2.9 million to more than 2,200 different charities around surrounding communities, eating the radioactive food from the farms. I was watching a documentary. Where these kids were asked if they can have one little wish of a toy or football or something like that, what would they want? And the kids said they would like to get a radio or a colored television or a TV because they're so bored. They're abandoned children in Ukraine and Belarus because of Chernobyl. But the nuclear power plants are not going to donate to the Chernobyl children. You get it? At 9 Mile Point Nuclear Station, Fitzpatrick Nuclear Power Plant employees pledged more than $290,000 to 265 charities. Imagine giving these children $290,000 worth of comfort, like a They can each have a color television and their own set of headphones. And at least they're abandoned, yes, but at least they can have something to pass the time with, right? Quanking the cracks or taking away our freedoms with COVID, guys, says Frederick Forst. If we do not lapse into renewed panic, plunge into gullibility and its consequence, obedience, and continue to wave goodbye to all our civil freedoms for which our forefathers fought so many times, who really governs us? The blob. It is this body, individually anonymous and invisible, to whom our elected representatives handed over the government of us all. They're talking about United Nations, obviously. And the United Nations has not the slightest intention of giving back our freedoms if it can be avoided. Every single one of the top 40 causes of death shows a spike over normal: heart disease, lungs, liver and kidney, cancer, diabetes, which are all stuff you get from eating radioactive poison food or bringing it in. And all increases, and they total more than COVID. Right? So COVID is the cover-up for the radiation sickness, for sure. Chazma Bay, Russia. This was the site of the biggest submarine radioactive event that we know about so far. More than 290 people, more than 300 people suffered, might as well say it, more than 300 people suffered from radiation exposures. And the surrounding ocean was used by the Soviet Navy as a nuclear waste dump, adding further to the radioactive contaminations of our planet and ocean. And the full extent of the environmental damage, health effects may never be fully known. On the morning of August 10, 1985, the nuclear reactor K431 Echo 2 submarine was in the process of being opened when a wave created by a passing Navy torpedo boat rocked the ship and caused all the fuel rods to dislodge. This, combined with human error, resulted in unintentional critical mass, leading to a spontaneous chain reaction. So once you does the chain reaction, once you ignite the fuel, now you change the property of the fuel permanently. Now it's lethal fuel and it can produce thousands of fission products. The massive explosion blew out the 12-ton upper lid and all of the nuclear fuel assemblies from the nuclear reactor compartment and destroyed the submarine's pressure hull. So you blew off the lid. If you blow the lid off, by proxy you have to blow out the fuel too, because the lids are very heavy. That one's 24,000 pounds. So if you can blow off something that weighs 24,000 pounds, where the fuel rods are too. Now the reactors in Japan are 350,000 pounds, and we see them blown off, which meant the fuel had to come out of it too. I know Swanee D was asking, if a big chunk of cement falls into the fuel pool on the fuel rods, could that start a chain reaction? Well, if the fuel rods touch each other, that'll cause a criticality. And so if a big chunk of cement falls on the fuel rods, many of them are going to touch. So 100% yes. And that will blow all the water out of the pool, and then everything melts down, right? The radioactive plume rose 50 meters above the submarine, traveled northwest. Does anybody really think the plume is going to stop at 50 feet? Leaving a trace of nuclear fallout in that area. Oh yeah, left a trace there. See, once again, it's not just a plume. It catches fire. It burns. It's a continuous plume. It's not like a backfire from a transport truck you see in traffic. The plume was 3.5 kilometers long. So when something goes pop, you don't create a plume that's 3.5 kilometers long. You create a little puff that floats, right? So in order to create a 3.5 kilometer long plume, meant you were burning. So it's going to be more than 50 feet high. It's not going to stop just there. And it's going to be more than 650 meters wide. 2,000 feet wide. At the same time, the ocean floor and part of the adjoining waterfronts are contaminated. A fire broke out on the Submarine. Fire. It was a criticality. It was criticality with no containment, releasing further radioactive isotopes like the iodine-131 and magnesium-54 for about 7 hours. Well, 7 hours is going to create a very, very huge amount. It's not just going to be, again, we see these words iodine-131, these connotations. You can't have iodine-131 without the 132, 133, the 130-29s. You can't have it because the reactors are running on plutonium, uranium. And so the biggest byproduct of the fuel rods is curium. And you need lead shielding 20 times thicker for curium than you do for the plutonium, which is named after the devil. Anyway, similar accidents in Russia's nuclear submarines reported in 1965, 1968, 1980, 1970. So they're talking about 4 more nuclear meltdowns. This is madness. This one was kept secret till 1993, which means it's still secret. You'll never know all the facts or details accurately. The explosion killed 10 people instantly. Gamma radiation doses reached 5 millisieverts. A nuclear meltdown is not 5 millisieverts, by the way. 5 sieverts. About 16,000 times the natural background radiation of 0.0003 millisieverts, and which is 5,000 microsieverts, which is 5,000th of a sievert, is what they're saying. This is absurdness. The radiation obviously is going to be in a many of sieverts. It could be 500 sieverts at the source. Not could be, it would be. So you have to ignore stuff like that. The rest of the radiation was released in the form of 259 petabecquerels of radioactive particles. You can't quantify that because when radiation is burning at these enormous temperatures, once it starts burning like that, we're talking enormous temperatures, 6, 7, 8,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. Right? So it's going to consume steel and rebar and everything else that it comes in contact with. It's going to atomize and aerosol and ionize and radiate that. That's going to add to the plume. And these are going to be full now of particles, which are neutron bombarded and high rates of emissions and splitting the atom. These things are splitting the atom at this stage, right? This form of radiation is especially dangerous to everything with replicating cells when ingested or inhaled. Particularly relevant for the population was the release of giga, which is billions becquerels of iodine-131. Well, a gram of radiation of cesium is 100 times, so it's 78 times 78 billion. Then multiply that by 100 per gram. Right, so the numbers they're telling you there, well, they sound scary, and they are, trust me, because each atom is nasty, but it's significantly, infinitely more than what they're able to articulate there. So multiply that by a couple of billion. The instrument was kept secret. We've done that. But 2,000 workers took part in emergency and decontamination procedures. 290 of them are exposed to radiation of more than what they're calling 50 millisieverts, 50,000 microsieverts. And they're saying they suffer from acute radiation sickness, which generally doesn't. In that environment, it would have been many, many sieverts. He said firefighters received doses of 2.2 sieverts of external irradiation, up to 4 sieverts to the thyroid, using the scumbag World Health Cancer Risk Factor for ionizing radiation of 0.2 sieverts, extrapolated by 44% of the workers would develop cancer. There's 1,800 illnesses and diseases and autoimmune deficiencies and injuries that will manifest before cancer. It's not just cancer. It's way worse and way quicker. You know, you'll drop dead from heart attacks right away, right? There's one town in Fukushima Prefecture where 12,700 people, excess people, died of heart attacks in a single month, in a single 30-day period. 205 of the workers were awarded certificates in 1998 entitling them to similar state benefits as the Chernobyl liquidators. Interesting name for people that are being murdered. Their organs are liquefied and call them liquidators. Kamikazes. In 1985, the levels of gamma radiation in 80% of the sediment samples, I'm having a hard time reading that, exceeded 6.6 millisieverts, approximately 2,000 times natural background radiation, even by the end of the 1990s. And radiation X-spots were showing up to 300 chest X-rays per hour. These are lethal doses, though, by the way. I was asked, can they build a sarcophagus on rails to put over the reactors? Well, they did put sarcophagus over these buildings, right? They done it to Unit 1, right? They built a Kevlar sarcophagus and put over that one. They built one over Reactor 3. But these were for deceptions, and they're not meant to contain the emissions. The problem is the reactor cores blew out of the buildings right away, or they melted down and went straight down into the earth below it. And it still wouldn't hurt to put a sarcophagus over it. But the problem, see, there's difference. Chernobyl was graphite, where these are pure uranium, pure plutonium. And so there is no reactor for reactor. Hang on. That's reactor 1 you're looking at. That's reactor 3 you're looking at. So there is no reactor there. It's completely gone. Same thing with reactor 4. It's completely gone. There is no building there. There's just this little. I'll show you though. Hang on. The whole industry is insane. So they built this structure with cranes to trick you into thinking there was a sarcophagus type over it. But this was more about pretending that it looked like that. That was to trick the population. That was to trick the population. And trick that population. The entire region is heavily polluted. An old and derelict nuclear submarine was scuttled here over a period of 7 decades ago. and a radioactive liquid and solid waste dumped into the sea. And high levels of radioisotopes such as cesium and strontium have been found in sediment samples. So when you talk about 0.6, 0.8 millisieverts, the level of radiation corresponds to about 30 to 400 chest x-rays per hour. And the numbers we're talking about are tens of thousands of times this. 5 days, there are cumulative doses of 1 sievert. Now, because you're talking about actual atoms in these places. You're talking about atoms, and they're going to pulse energy every second. About every second. Turkey nuclear plant threatens East Mediterranean system. Nuclear is considered a clean source of energy because no carbon dioxide is emitted during operation. Again, this is craziness to say that nuclear power plants don't have any emissions. They're boiling 1 million gallons a minute of water. That's emissions. Because each glass of water has 1 billion creatures. 75 to 100 million of them are the phytoplankton, the basis of the food chain, the basis of the oxygen chain, the basis of the carbon sequestering chain. But there's 1 billion creatures per glass of water, and there's 16 million times 1 billion creatures every minute boiled off. So when you kill these creatures, that's emissions, right? But each reactor needs 2 power plants to run it. So 2 gas, 2 coal, 2 oil plants to run it. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 300. So you need the 2 plants to build it, to run it for its lifetime, and then 60 years to try to decommission it. Plus, it's boiling the emissions into the environment. Now, after a couple of years, they start producing used fuel. That fuel goes into a pool at the top of the buildings that has to be replenished by about 120,000 liters a day because that's boiled off into the community. So the fuel rods that are in the pool are still splitting the same atoms as they were to power millions of homes, except they're no longer 1,000 psi. And they're no longer boiling water, but they are still boiling water. They boil off about 120,000 liters into the community. Each liter is saturated with the atoms that are captured from the splitting. So the atoms are split from the fuel rods, are captured in by the water, and then the water becomes saturated. That's released because it's boiled off up to thin stacks. Or if they got too much, after a while they have to build pipes directly out into the ocean to release the water because it's not able to stop the chain reaction anymore because now it's saturated with radiation. All activities related to building and running a plant led to the production of a high amount of CO2, including the current construction and plant development processes. However, again, CO2 is not what's heating the planet. Heating the planet is the radioactive fallout from decades, from 75 years of nuclear invisible plumes, and then Fukushima releasing constant plumes covering the planet. CO2 doesn't pulse energy at the speed of light, or at all, certainly not at the speed of light every second for millions and millions of years. That's heating the planet up. Power plant is located close to the Eastern Mediterranean, a region which comprises a vast set of coastal and marine ecosystems. that deliver valuable benefits to all its coastal inhabitants. The region is set to experience negative environmental change because of the huge amount of water that will be required to cool the plant's reactors. So this is in India. Or Turkey. The region is set to experience negative environmental changes. Pumping the seawater used to cool the 4 reactors back into the sea could lead to an 80% increase in water temperatures. And the temperature rise would affect the area's marine diversity, which is all 100% right. Environmentalists expect a decline in the number of fish because of the high temperatures. Will probably kill most of them and reduce the egg-laying capabilities of the rest. Well, the studies were shown, like Indian Point and the one in New Jersey, were killing 12 to 9 billion fish, adult fishes a year. 300 billion baby fishes each year in these water intakes. And, like turtles and sturgeons and everything else. The high temperatures will also make the marine environment uninhabitable for a colony of Mediterranean monk seals and a very rare species of sea daffodils. They're like a plant. The government was influenced to hasten and conclude the evaluation process to favor its establishment, which may consider unsafe because of seismic activities in the area. So, this is a very, very bad place to put it, yeah? Well, graphite is not like uranium and plutonium. Graphite is used as a moderator to control the reaction so it doesn't get out of control. Whereas pure uranium, pure plutonium, I guess a layman's way to think about it was, if I fill up a 1 liter jug of whiskey and I fill up another jug with a couple of spoonfuls, and then I fill the rest of it up with water, which one is going to get you drunk the quickest, right? The pure liter of whiskey. Well, pure uranium, pure plutonium is the same thing compared to graphite, where it's the raw form. It's not a watered down version of it. That's what graphite is basically. Now, the graphite becomes radioactive through the process, has lethal doses, don't get me wrong, but it's different, right? One is a pure form of radioactivity, the other one is a watered down version. They're still lethal, but it's a watered down version of the other one. European Parliament has called on the Turkish government to halt construction of the plant site, and the location is in a region prone to severe earthquakes. According to the European Parliament, the location of the site in a region prone to earthquakes poses a threat to Turkey, the entire Mediterranean region, which is 100% correct. Again, they're almost paraphrasing what Suzuki had said earlier, that if the plant goes, it's bye-bye Japan, and should evacuate the coastlines of the northern hemisphere. They're basically paraphrasing it, but localized, right? For, thousands of miles. The facility is situated 60 miles from a fault line at the meeting point of Eurasian and African tectonic plates. So the plates could go under a lot of stress for a long time. They're just hair triggers. And then all of a sudden they let go. And that creates the tsunami also when you're at the tectonic plates themselves. So there are legitimate reasons to be concerned about building a plant in a vulnerable area, which is where they prefer to build these places. That's why we call them a death cult. That's why they call it a death cult, right? And that's why we got a poll tonight. Should nuclear power be renamed the nuclear death cult? We got 42 votes and 88% of people says yes, it's a death cult, for goodness sakes. It's a death cult. A nuclear engineering professor from Istanbul University, one of the original nuclear engineers assigned the site's license, in 1976 indicated the current construction is based on ignorant planning and may pose a considerable threat to the Mediterranean regions. It argues the conditions of the areas has changed and the threat of earthquake needs to be assessed before proceeding with the project, which, you know, that's a legitimate strong earthquake could result in devastation, like, and to get that fake study showed up again. We challenged that with a whole show. And well, we'll let it go right there, which is not bad. That was a good pull. That was a good one. We made that far tonight. And so what I had left was a bunch of studies. I had a bunch of studies left we're not going to get to tonight. We'll get to these studies tonight. December 2021, this month, this study came out. The largest nuclear accident in the history of the nuclear fleet. I'll end it on that. There's the Consulate, the K-121 or something. I can't remember now. Submarine that sank up by the Arctic. Norway and the Russians done a study, said that the hull wouldn't concede to the ocean for at least 1,000 years, which is absurd, right? It's not going to last 3 years, let alone 1,000 years. And it was such a despicable study that they would do something like that. We'll try to pick up there. Tomorrow night we're going to show part 3 of the pictures, of the original pictures from Fukushima. The original pictures from Fukushima. We got 2 parts up, well, 3 parts. The first one was 736 pictures where I showed a couple of hundred screen captures of the zooms because they were taken by drones. And all the reactors were redacted. All the pictures of the reactors and surrounding areas were redacted. And at 45 votes, 89% says that nuclear power should be renamed a nuclear death cult. That's a crazy, it's crazy numbers, isn't it? Okay, well, we'll let it go with that. We'll see everybody tomorrow night. Hopefully, they find some more victims of those tornadoes, those supercell tornadoes tonight. My heart really does go out to all of these people. And their families and their friends and their loved ones that are seeking the information. My heart goes out to all the people that might eat Fukushima radioactive food in Britain in the near future and everywhere else. It's time to fight back against this despicable, coward, disgusting, revolting nuclear industry. God bless everybody. Hugs for everybody. We'll see everybody tomorrow night. Have a great night, great day tomorrow. I haven't stopped, so I'm going to let it go right there. Hopefully I get some rest tonight. God bless. Have a great night, folks. Take care.